Good evening, generals, and welcome to another episode from Men Around the Führer. We speak tonight of Karl Rudolf Geert von Rundstedt. He was born to be the finest jewel of the Prussian officer corps, yet forced to serve the Bohemian corporal he privately despised. He was a creature of tradition in a whirlwind of radical destruction. His life stretched from the fading light of the German Empire into the absolute darkness of the Third Reich. Born in Ash, Lebanon on December 12, 1875, Jay came from the Uradel, the old nobility, a family whose lineage stretched back centuries. For generations, the men of the Rundstedt line had pledged their lives to the Prussian army. For Jay, entering military service in 1892, age 17, was not a choice but an expectation. He was deeply immersed in Prussian military values, discipline, honor, and duty, principles that would shape his entire life and leadership style. Though he initially wished to follow the cavalry tradition, the family's limited finances guided him toward the infantry. His military path was the arduous but prestigious road of the Prussian elite cadet college Schüler, and eventually in 1907, the illustrious General Staff. The General Staff was Germany's military elite, and Rundstedt excelled within its rigorous intellectual demands. During his time there, he qualified as a French interpreter, a skill that would prove exceptionally useful decades later. His superiors noted his outstanding eye for country and his intellect, educated above his age. When the Great War broke out in 1914, Rundstedt, holding the rank of captain, served mostly as a staff officer, eventually becoming Chief of Staff to Army Corps, fighting on both the Eastern and Western fronts. He ended World War I still a major with a high reputation as a staff officer. The war's end brought revolution and the humiliating Treaty of Versailles, which severely restricted the German military. But Rundstedt, always the career officer, remained in the small 100,000-man Reichswehr. He rose steadily, holding key staff positions and eventually reaching the rank of full general in October 1932. The year 1932 was pivotal. Rundstedt had reached the highest rank in the Reich era just 3 months before Adolf Hitler seized power. The political landscape shifted radically, forcing Rundstedt to navigate the treacherous waters of the Nazi regime. Rundstedt, though dedicated to the defense of the nation, quickly developed a deep disdain for the Nazis, famously referring to them as the brown dirt and calling Hitler a Bohemian corporal. Yet his guiding star was the traditional Prussian belief that an officer must not interfere in politics. He must support the government of the day, whatever its nature. This deep-rooted adherence to Prussian military honor and obedience guided his professional life even as it constrained him politically. In 1934, like the entire army, Rundstedt took a new personal oath of loyalty to Hitler. This oath, taken in allegiance to the head of state, became the unbreakable chain that bound him to the regime. The tension between his convictions and the regime flared in early 1938 with the infamous Bloomberg Free affair. When General von Rundstedt was ousted on fabricated charges, Rundstedt, along with other senior officers, angrily met with Hitler. Rundstedt defended Rundstedt, insisting on his right to defend himself before a court of honor. This action, born of commitment to military tradition and justice, demonstrated his adherence to honor rather than direct opposition to the Nazi political machine. In late 1938, nearing his 63rd birthday, Rundstedt retired ostensibly at his own request. Though Hitler respected his dignity and ability, his opposition to plans against Czechoslovakia and his defense of Free may have accelerated his departure. He thought he was done with the service, but fate in the form of war soon intervened. In June 1939, Hitler recalled Rundstedt to active service. He was given command of army groups south for the coming invasion of Poland. His forces cut off the Polish retreat across the Vistula and played a key role in the capture of Warsaw. The campaign demonstrated Rundstedt's proficiency in mobile warfare, even as he vainly urged Hitler not to bombard Warsaw and to extend humane treatment to the civilian population. These early actions, however, were stained by incidents of German troops shooting surrendered Polish soldiers and killing civilians, which later formed part of the war crimes charges against him. Following success in Poland, Rundstedt was given command of Army Group A for the spring 1940 attack in Western Europe. He was quick to see the merits of the highly controversial plan devised by General Erich von Manstein, who was then his chief of staff. This Manstein plan called for a daring armored thrust through the Ardennes, aimed at trapping the Allied field armies in Belgium and northern France. It was on Rundstedt's vital advice that Hitler eventually accepted this revolutionary strategy. Rundstedt commanded a massive force, 7 panzer divisions, 3 motorized divisions, and 35 infantry divisions. The ensuing campaign brought overwhelming success, seemingly sealing Rundstedt's position in Hitler's favor, and resulting in his promotion to Field Marshal on July 19, 1940. But even in victory, the friction between the cautious professional and the aggressive Nazi mentality was apparent. Rundstedt harbored doubts about the aggressive tactics of General Heinz Guderian, whose armored forces reached the coast on May 20th, separating the British Expeditionary Force (BEF) and French forces. Rundstedt argued that the tanks should halt and wait for the infantry divisions to catch up. A common request from Kleist as well as their armored forces were thinly stretched and had suffered significant losses. This caution culminated in the infamous halt order at Dunkirk. Guerrero, Guyon, Kluger, and Rundstedt suggested that the German forces encircling the Dunkirk pocket should cease their advance. Hitler sanctioned the order on May 24, 1940, supported by the German High Command, reasoning that the terrain around Dunkirk was unsuitable for armor. The halt order stopped Guderian from cutting off the trapped Allied forces. This 3-day pause gave the Allies sufficient time to organize the Dunkirk evacuation, allowing over 330,000 Allied troops to escape to England. Rundstedt later called this an incredible blunder, assigning full blame to Hitler, who was influenced by Göring, who had asked for the chance to destroy the forces using the Luftwaffe. Some historians note that the original request for a pause came from Klee and Rundstedt himself, who worried about the exposed armor. Regardless of the true genesis, Rundstedt believed that if he had had his way, the English would not have got off so lightly at Dunkirk, as his 5 Panzer divisions were kept uselessly outside the port. After the fall of France, Rundstedt initially remained as Commander-in-Chief West, overseeing preparations for the proposed invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, an operation he never took seriously. But Hitler's true ambition lay east. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, commenced in June 1941, placing Rundstedt in command of Army Group South. His primary task was conquering Ukraine, capturing Kiev and penetrating as far east as Stalingrad to cut off Soviet supply routes and seize the Caucasus oil fields. Rundstedt's armies achieved significant victories culminating in the Battle of Kiev, described as the largest encirclement in history. Over 600,000 Russian prisoners were taken in Kiev alone, yet even this triumph resulted more from Stalin's inflexibility than Rundstedt's talents. As Rundstedt himself noted that the catastrophe resulted from Stalin's obduracy and incompetence. Rundstedt wrote to his wife, acknowledging the scale of the conflict. The distances in Russia devour us. He realized quickly that Germany's initial belief in a quick victory was unrealistic. Rundstedt's command in the east was marked not only by military victory, but also by deep moral decay. Hitler had made it clear that this was to be a war of extermination. The infamous Commissar order dictated that all Red Army commissars were to be executed when captured. Rundstedt testified at Nuremberg that the general attitude of the older leaders was unanimously and absolutely against it, claiming the order was simply not carried out. However, the historic record shows the Commissar order was widely carried out. More damningly, Rundstedt was implicated in the atrocities committed by the Insads group, the murder squads operating behind the lines. Field Marshal Walter Reichau, part of Army Group South, issued the notorious Reichau Order or Severity Order in October 1941, proclaiming that the goal was the absolute destruction of the means of power and the eradication of the Asian influence in the European cultural sphere, and that the soldier must understand the necessity of hard but just atonement of Jewish subhumanity. Rundstedt openly endorsed this order, circulating it to his senior commanders with the comment, "I thoroughly concur with its contents," urging them to impress upon their troops the need to exterminate the Jews. This contradicted his later claims to interrogators that he knew little about the Einheiten's actions. He knew, and by endorsing the order he sat silent and acquiescent, witnessing the commission of crimes on a scale larger and more shocking than the world has ever had the misfortune to know, a point that would later be used to summarize the complicity of the officer corps. As autumn turned to winter, the campaign faltered. Rundstedt realized his exhausted troops needed to regroup. He wanted to halt on the Dnieper for the winter, rest and be re-equipped. When a Red Army counterattack forced the Germans back from Rostov in late November 1941, Rundstedt, who had suffered a heart attack, authorized a tactical withdrawal to the Mayos line. Hitler was furious, viewing any retreat as unacceptable. Rundstedt replied by wire, stating his position clearly. "It is madness to attempt to hold. In the first place, the troops cannot do it. And in the second place, if they do not retreat, they will be destroyed. I repeat, that this order be rescinded or that you find someone else." This act of defiance sealed his fate. Hitler sacked him on December 1, 1941, replacing him with Reich. However, after meeting with other senior officers who defended Rundstedt's action, Hitler grudgingly accepted the explanation, claiming the dismissal was a misunderstanding. On December 5, 1941, with his honor seemingly restored, Rundstedt left Pava, never to return to the Russian front. Upon returning home, he received a gift from Hitler, a check for 250,000 Reichmarks, part of the Führer's policy of buying the continuing loyalty of his senior commanders. Rundstedt initially tried not to cash it, handing the money over to his daughter-in-law, where it remained untouched at his death in 1953. Rundstedt was recalled to duty in March 1942. Returning to his role as Commander-in-Chief West, OB West, he established his headquarters in the comfortable Hotel Pavon Henry IV near Paris. His primary task now was to oversee the construction of the Atlantic Wall, defending the French and Belgian coasts against the expected Allied invasion. Rundstedt had little faith in this massive network of fortifications. He saw the Atlantic Wall merely as useful propaganda, convinced that it had one intrinsic weakness. The link lines between the fortresses were vulnerable to sabotage by the French resistance. He critically gave the wall a life expectancy of 24 hours once the Allies began their landings. He declared to Hitler, "We Germans do not indulge in the tired Maginot spirit." His professional life in the West was soon complicated by the arrival of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel in 1943, a junior officer allowed to dilute Rundstedt's orders because he had the ear of Hitler. The two field marshals became embroiled in a fierce and significant strategic disagreement, the Rommel-Rundstedt controversy. Rommel, influenced by the overwhelming power of Allied air superiority, believed the invasion must be stopped directly on the beaches. He wanted the armored panzer divisions positioned close to the coast. Rundstedt, however, believed that attempting to stop the invasion on the beaches was impossible. He was wary of the powerful guns of Allied naval vessels which he believed were capable of shattering German armored formations too close to the sea. Citing the Salerno landings in Italy as evidence, Rundstedt, supported by the commander of armored forces, General Lauga Fonenberg, argued that the panzers should be held back and deployed further inland as a strategic reserve to launch a mass counterattack after the initial Allied foothold, engaging them in a mobile war. Ultimately, Hitler intervened, retaining command of the armored divisions and placing them largely under his own control, meaning they could only be released on his direct orders. This unworkable command structure, with RML controlling Army Group B and Rundstedt nominally controlling the overall defense, was destined to fail. Beyond the major strategic debate, Rundstedt also had direct responsibility for implementing the severe wartime orders that followed his return to France. In July 1942, he issued the first commando order, instructing that captured Allied parachutists be handed over to the Gestapo, whether in uniform or not. Hitler followed up in October 1942 with a second order stipulating that all captured Allied commandos were to be executed. Although Rundstedt was not always directly involved in the resulting executions, he was later held responsible as the German commander in France. Before dawn on June 6, 1944, the long-expected Allied invasion began in Normandy, far to the west of where Rundstedt and Rommel primarily expected it. Rommel was away in Germany for his wife's birthday, but the 68-year-old Rundstedt was up before 0300, attempting to seize control of the confusing situation. He immediately recognized the reported Allied airborne landings as the precursor to the seaborne invasion. Rundstedt contacted OKW Armed Forces High Command and demanded immediate authority to deploy the critical panzer reserves. However, due to Hitler's earlier directive, OKW could not comply without the Führer's personal approval, who was asleep at Berchtesgaden. This crucial delay meant the armored reserves could not move until the cloud cover lifted, allowing Allied air power to dominate, thus preventing an effective counteroffensive. Rundstedt's belief that the Allies needed to be wiped out before the day's end proved tragically impossible. Military historians credit Rundstedt as the only high command officer who responded correctly to the crisis, noting his sound reasoning and decisive action. By June 11th, it was evident the Allies could not be dislodged. Allied air superiority and French resistance sabotage severely hampered German reinforcement efforts. Rundstedt, now supported by Rommel, tried to convince Hitler and Keitel to allow a withdrawal from Normandy to a prepared defensive line on the Seine River, but Hitler forbade any retreat. On June the 17th, Hitler flew to France to meet with Rundstedt and Rommel near Soissons. Both field marshals argued that the situation demanded either massive reinforcements or rapid withdrawal. Remarkably, they both also urged Hitler to seek a political solution to end the war, telling him bluntly that it was unwinnable. Hitler ignored their demands, insisting on fanatical defense. On July 1, 1944, Rundstedt reached his breaking point. After receiving an urgent plea from Panzer Commander Schiepenberg to withdraw his units from the devastating range of Allied naval gunfire, Rundstedt agreed, informing Okabu. An order soon arrived, reversing Rundstedt's decision. In a fury, Rundstedt called Keitel, urging him to get the decision reversed. Keitel pleaded that this was impossible and asked, "What shall we do?" Rundstedt's famous desperate reply was shouted down the phone line, "Idiot." While the German phrase literally translates to end the war, "You idiots," it has been commonly reported in English-language accounts as "make peace." "You fools." Keitel conveyed that Rundstedt felt unable to cope, and Hitler relieved him of command on July 6, 1944. Rundstedt was replaced by Field Marshal von Rundstedt. Rundstedt told Rommel upon departing that he was grateful not to have to experience the coming catastrophe in a position of leadership, and that he would never hold another military command. Just days after Rundstedt's dismissal, the famous July 20th plot to kill Hitler and overthrow the regime unfolded. Rundstedt, the traditionalist, had resisted all attempts by conspirators to recruit him over the years. He had stuck firmly to his principle that officers should avoid politics. When he heard of the assassination attempt, his reaction was hostile. "I would never have thought of such a thing. That would have been base, barefaced treachery." He argued that even if successful, he would have been considered for all time as the greatest traitor to my fatherland. Despite his lack of involvement in the conspiracy, Rundstedt could not escape the bloody aftermath. Hitler, determined to break the Prussian officer, Size Power ordered the convening of a military court of honor, Bon Ehrenhof, to expel all accused plotters from the army, so they could be tried by the Nazi People's Court. Rundstedt was appointed to head this court. This court considered evidence placed before it by the Gestapo, permitted no defense counsel, and allowed none of the accused to appear. Under Rundstedt's chairmanship, 55 officers were dishonorably discharged, including his old colleague, Field Marshal von Witzleben, and controversially Rommel, who chose suicide over a show trial to protect his family. No single incident damaged Rundstedt's posthumous reputation as much as his involvement in this process, leading critics to call the proceedings the final fare of casuistry. Despite this grim duty, Rundstedt later served as Hitler's representative at RML's state funeral in October 1944. The war was rapidly being lost in the autumn of 1944. In the east, Army Group Center was routed. In the west, the Allies had swept across France. Following the suicide of Kluge and the incapacitation of Rommel, Rundstedt was again recalled by Hitler to resume his post as OB West in September 1944. The appointment of Rundstedt, the most senior and recognized German commander, was partly a propaganda exercise meant to inspire confidence at home and trepidation among the Allies, who regarded him with respect, almost awe. However, Hitler intended him primarily as a figurehead with operational control resting with Field Marshal Walter Model. Rundstedt believed the only effective defensive line could be established on the Rhine, a view Hitler would not countenance, instead insisting on a stand on the West Wall, Siegfried Line. In December 1944, Rundstedt was forced to preside over Hitler's last desperate counteroffensive in the West. Operation Vaktam Rhin, known to the Allies as the Battle of the Bulge. Rundstedt harbored deep doubts about the feasibility of the plan, which aimed to split the Allied forces by driving to Antwerp. Rundstedt proposed alternative plans, including a pincer operation near Aachen, taking into consideration the limited resources, but Hitler dismissed all adjustments to his detailed vision. Hitler attached a handwritten note to the final plan not to be altered, effectively reducing Rundstedt to a powerless figurehead. Rundstedt complained bitterly that absolutely all conditions for the possible success of such an offensive were lacking, noting that reaching Antwerp was simply beyond the Wehrmacht's capabilities. He famously objected to the offensive being named after him, insisting that the so-called Rundstedt offensive was a complete misnomer and that he had nothing to do with it. Despite his grave professional objections, Rundstedt issued the necessary call to action for his troops on December 15, 1944. Soldiers of the West Front, your great hour has arrived. We gamble everything. You carry with you the holy obligation to give everything to achieve things beyond human possibilities, for our fatherland and our Führer. Rundstedt soon recognized that the offensive was doomed, urging OKW to halt the operation to prevent it from becoming a second Stalingrad. His fears were validated by Allied resistance and improving weather, which allowed Allied air forces to attack. The campaign failed, culminating in the Allies capturing the Ludendorff Bridge at Reich intact over the Rhine on March 7, 1945. This failure provided Hitler with a final scapegoat. On March 9, 1945, Hitler informed Rundstedt he would be replaced by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, ending von Rundstedt's 52-year military career. Rundstedt had a final audience with Hitler on March 11th, who thanked him for his loyalty. Rundstedt's long career ended on May 1, 1945, when he was captured by American troops from the 36th Infantry Division near Bad Tolz, where he had been staying due to his worsening heart condition and arthritis. During his initial interrogation, the strain caused him to suffer another heart attack. He was held initially in Luxembourg, and then transferred to British custody. Rundstedt was charged with responsibility for war crimes in Poland, the Soviet Union, the actions of the Einitz Group, Britain, the Commando Order, and France, the Ordor Massacre. In 1946, Rundstedt appeared as a defense witness before the International Military Tribunal (IMT) at Nuremberg. He sought to defend the honor of the officer CPS. Under questioning, Rundstedt was steadfast in his core claims. 1. Political disdain. He asserted the generals did not involve themselves in politics. 2. The oath. He emphasized that he and his fellow commanders obeyed Hitler because he had been called into government legally by Hindenburg and subsequently became Führer based on Hindenburg's testament. 3. Conduct of war. He insisted that the rules of warfare and international law were always binding for us older leaders, and that strict observance was demanded of the troops. He claimed they were trained in traditions of decency and chivalry. 4. Disobedience. He claimed that the Commissar order was simply not carried out, and that the Commando order was not implemented in the West. Though he admitted that declining to execute the order directly rather than tacitly ignoring it involved a certain insincerity to avoid confrontation with Hitler, the IMT ultimately acquitted the General Staff and High Command collectively, though it called them a ruthless military caste and a disgrace to the profession of arms. However, the court left open the possibility that members, including Rundstedt, could still face individual prosecution for their crimes. The controversy surrounding his complicity and atrocities remained. His endorsement of the Reich severity order in Russia contradicted his post-war assertions of ignorance. Had he stood trial, historians conclude he would likely have been found guilty of some charges similar to Manstein. However, due to his advanced age and failing health marked by chronic arteriosclerosis and osteoarthritis, and amid shifting political priorities with the onset of the Cold War, the British government halted his prosecution. He was released in May 1949. The last years of Rundstedt's life were difficult. Released at age 73, frail and in poor health, he had lost his home in Kassel and his family estate in Saxony. He was still regarded by the Americans as a Class I war criminal under denazification laws, freezing his bank account and denying him a pension. He wrote to his contact military historian Basil Littlehart, "It is an awful situation for me and my poor wife. I would like to end this life as soon as possible." He was temporarily housed in an elderly person's home near Schell. His only son Hanskur died of throat cancer in early 1948, a blow from which the old field marshal never truly recovered. Rundstedt's wife, Louise, died in October 1952. Georg von Rundstedt followed soon after, dying of heart failure in Hanover on February 24, 1953, at the age of 77. He was buried in the Stucken City Cemetery. Narrator Georg von Rundstedt's legacy remains contentious. He was the epitome of the honorable Prussian officer, an accomplished leader whose dignity and ability were respected even by his enemies. General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself reportedly considered him the most capable German general. Yet he was trapped by an archaic code. His adherence to duty and his refusal to mutiny, as General Manstein famously noted, "Prussian field marshals do not mutiny," meant that his skills were placed in service of a regime he knew to be criminal. He sought political neutrality, but his silence and acquiescence, especially regarding the atrocities in the East, were interpreted by critics as complicity. His case encapsulates the profound dilemma faced by professional soldiers under a totalitarian regime: the tragic tension between an ingrained sense of duty and the overriding call of moral responsibility. He was truly the last Prussian, serving his country to the bitter criminal end. Don't forget to subscribe WWII Untold YouTube family.